Welcome to episode 15 of Scraps of Reason. In this episode, we spoke to socialist Irish politician Ruth Coppinger, who shared with us her experience of being a TD, serving people, raising attention to the most difficult social issues, and how to be the change. Listen to her unapologetically raw social and political commentary. So, welcome to episode 15 of Scraps of Reason. And this episode, we have the great pleasure to speak with Ruth Coppinger, my personal hero, who served as a TD in Dublin West constituency between the year 2014 and 2020. And she works currently and previously also as a secondary school teacher. Ruth Coppinger made Irish political history in 2016 when she became the first woman in Ireland to be nominated for Taoiseach. She came into politics from activism, and she still is this very strong socialist voice in Ireland who speaks for the oppressed and those who need support in fighting for their rights. Ruth was also a founding member of ROSA, a movement for reproductive justice in Ireland. She was also strongly involved in the Repeal the Aid campaign, and till this day she's advocating for abortion rights in Ireland. Also speaks loud of the victim-blaming tactics used in courtrooms, and she believes that good sex education bill is necessary for factual school education and for improving many health issues, including mental health. She is famous for joining protests in communities to help them and support them in their fights for their rights. So, welcome to Scraps of Reason.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction.
I hope it was fair.
It was amazing.
So, yes, as I said, I'm really impressed with your work. I've been following you for quite a while. I'm delighted to be given this opportunity to speak to you today. Recently, when I had the pleasure to record a podcast with Olivia Tehan from the Sexual Health Centre in Cork, one of the complaints I have heard was about the provision of Objective Sex Education Bill of 2018 being stuck in the Dáil. I know that you are personally involved in bringing attention to this bill. What we can read online is that this bill is currently before Dáil in his third stage, and that is since September 2020. Could you please tell us about its nature, your own history with it, and what it means that the bill is in its third stage and where we stand with this? Is it possible in the near future for Irish students to receive factual and objective relationship and sexuality education? What do you think?
Well, the reason that we put the bill, myself and my colleagues, in 2018 was because we could see the need that was there throughout society for objective, consent-based sex education that's LGBT plus friendly, that deals with contraception, that deals with reproductive rights. And the irony was that we had a referendum on same-sex marriage equality in 2015, but yet somebody who is LGBT in society and who's young will never hear that affirmed in school, because the relationship and sexuality program won't deal with it. It most likely, if you're in a school with a Catholic ethos, or even community-based schools, to be honest, because of, the influence of Catholicism. And we had, at that point, we had the vote to allow abortion rights in Ireland. And one of the recommendations of the Committee on the Eighth Amendment, which I was a member of, was that there needed to be proper sex education in our schools, with contraception, abortion, all being allowed to be taught and discussed. So we put the bill, and we got, I have to say, of all the bills that we put in the Dáil, because we're a small socialist party and group, obviously, we don't normally get all of our bills supported, but we got huge support from organisations throughout Ireland, youth groups, student groups, women's groups, LGBT plus groups, and a momentum definitely built up around the bill. So the nature of the bill was very simple. It was saying that there needed to be reform in this area, and it did mention issues that had to be dealt with, like consent, contraception, and LGBT rights. Now, the reason for consent being so necessary, this is a worldwide issue.
Yes.
Where we have what even the former Taoiseach, now Taoiseach Leo Varadkar, called an epidemic of sexual violence. And yet there's no discussion throughout society and in our schools about this issue. And we know that young people are not, properly discussing what consent means in relationships, what it means to seek somebody's enthusiastic consent to have any sexual interaction with them. And that's a discussion that needs to be had, in my view, throughout the length and breadth of society. But obviously you should start in schools with young people. And the fact that this isn't happening is being shown by loads of surveys that are done in third level when students get to college, where 74% of young people said that they felt their sex education in school left out very important issues. But also there have been surveys in colleges. Most recently now, there's been a very big campus-wide survey done by USI and the NUIG. And the figures are shocking for the level of sexual harassment, abuse and sexual misconduct of all different kinds, and rape, where almost 1 in 3 women or non-binary people had experienced non-consensual sex in their college experience. Now, non-consensual sex is rape, as in they didn't give their conscious consent. So one of the issues is that there should be a lot more education on this issue throughout society, and it should start in schools. But the reason for the bill being stopped, just to bring it up to date, the bill did pass second stage, as it's called, which is the stage where there's a debate on it. And a lot of pressure came on Fianna Fáil about it from different groups, and they were forced to support it at second stage. But what's happened, unfortunately, is a bureaucratic manoeuvre or a parliamentary trick, whereby a bill can pass at a certain stage but then be just left languishing, left sitting on the shelf, or the government can introduce what they call a money message, which, without blinding your listeners with science, means that there's an ironic situation where you can't pass a bill or propose a bill in Parliament that would put a cost onto the state. And so they were actually trying to claim that a sex education programme would be a cost on the state, which is ludicrous, because we're meant to be having sex education regardless of this bill passing or not.
Yes.
RSE programs in schools. I mean, the only cost they could cite would be the training of teachers, but it's just a manoeuvre, and they've applied this trick to a lot of bills that they just don't want to pass, like even environmental bills or bills that aren't necessarily to do with the economy. And the reason that they don't want to pass the bill is because they don't want to tackle the role and influence of the Catholic Church in education in Ireland.
Of course.
Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, which are the two big parties in the state, have a history of being interconnected with the Catholic Church, obviously throughout the last 100 years. We're seeing this playing out now with the mother and baby homes issue. We're seeing it in relation to the control that they gave the Catholic Church for the last 100 years since independence. And even though, yes, some things have changed, the change has never really come from Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael. The change has always come from outside Parliament, from young people, from women, from working class people. The change has always come from pressure outside, from movements from below. And they would prefer not to have a conflict with the Catholic Church, because on the issue of sex education, the Catholic Church is allowed, in the Education Act, keep an ethos for a school. So any religion is. So if something goes against the ethos of the school, they can prevent it being taught. So you have a situation whereby sex education is either partially taught or not taught at all, maybe. We just don't know, because there isn't really a proper check on that. But we just know from anecdotal evidence from young people. So that's where the bill is at. It's been just kept buried there. Now, the bill has had an effect, however. The Education Committee in the Dáil had a discussion on sex education. And they basically came out with a report which supported all of the things that we'd said in our bill. But the only niggling issue is, well, it's a big issue, is this one about changing the Education Act so that ethos can't be used to prevent something being taught. And that's still there. And also, despite the report coming out from the Education Committee, which was a good report, they haven't actually done anything to train teachers or to devise a proper programme. So my own belief is that young people, women, the movement outside the Dáil that brought us the change that we have had in Ireland in terms of repeal, in terms of marriage equality, has to engage on this issue and has to force them to enact the provisions of this bill.
Yes. That's when you look at the fact that the bill reached its third stage, you might think it's quite hopeful. But the way you explain how the bureaucracy works there, it's very easy to lose any hope that it will actually ever, the change will actually ever come from the Dáil itself. So what are you telling us is that we need to pressure, the pressure has to come from the outside. So what, one thing I want to clarify, because you were elaborating there on the fact that the ethos of the Catholic schools is put before the right to objective and factual sex education. The ethos of the school, just to clarify, is the ethos of the patron, isn't that correct?
Yes. Yeah.
So it's not the ethos of the parents, because the situation in Ireland, like we have a situation which is in many ways similar in Poland when it comes to the sexual education, but Polish public schools are secular. Yeah, although they are secular, we still have this huge influence of the Catholic Church over the sex education. So that's why this subject is very interesting for me to compare with the Polish situation. And also because I have a small child, and I really wish from a personal perspective that the change will come by the time he actually reaches that age when he will be in need of this knowledge, which is vital, as you said. And as you said, this matter of the objective and factual sex education at schools ties and with so many different social matters, which are so important for the health of the society. It's not only a matter of teaching objective sexual education and the relationship at schools, is also to better the communities and the whole society. And so could you maybe, what we as, like I ask Olivia Tehan that question as well, what we simple people, what we can do to help to push that bell, or to not the bell, because as you're saying, there's nothing we can do about that, but to change the fact that the ethos of the school.
Well, I think there's a few things.
Just one second, because this bothers me that it is called the ethos of the school, but it's actually the ethos of the patron. And if it was the ethos of the school, if the schools had a democratic way of deciding on issues, if the parents had the right to vote on things, for instance, as some kind of parents committee, the ethos of the schools probably would be different. Then it would be the ethos of the schools, meaning the ethos of the people, the parents and their children. And at present, it's not actually the ethos of the school, it's the ethos of the patron. Yes, sorry. Mm-hmm.
No, I mean, we've reached the 3rd anniversary of the repeal referendum, where people went out in their huge numbers to endorse social progress in Ireland. They voted to support women. They voted to support choice, but they also were voting for the type of Ireland that is much more progressive. But the problem is we have massive unfinished business for social progress in Ireland. And the irony is you have this amazing contradiction whereby people went out and voted in such large numbers for abortion rights, but yet the schools and hospitals are largely still controlled by the Catholic Church. It's also ironic that the Catholic Church played no actual role in the referendum itself. They had to just stay out of it, because you put your finger on it there. People send their children to school, but they don't necessarily agree with the Catholic ethos of that school. They have to send their children to whatever school they can get them into. Most people don't have a choice. I mean, there are Educate Together schools available in certain areas, but not for everybody. And I think what we need, quite simply, is the separation of church and state. We need a publicly run health service that's universal, that caters for everyone's need, not based on how much money they have. And we need an education system that's secular. And if people wish to, have communions and confirmations and religious ceremonies, by all means, they can do that after school. But to expect teachers, which is the other ridiculous thing, that teachers are expected to carry out these religious traditions in Catholic schools, even if they're not religious themselves. So we have to start. What we can do is we have to demand the full separation of church and state. And you're right in that if you look at the doll, you might be quite, disillusioned. But they are susceptible to change on these issues. Like, even if you look at the mother and baby homes issue, they've had to bring in a bill on birth certificate rights. Now, they've had to bring it forward, and that was largely because of the outrage and outcry that happened after in the autumn, when this thing about sealing the records of the mother and baby homes came about. Now, for your listeners, the mother and baby homes were the places. They were actually institutions and prisons in reality, where they sent any person who wasn't married and was pregnant, and they kept them there, and then they gave them no choice in terms of their own child. Children were basically stolen in reality, and sometimes trafficked for money to the US to be adopted. So this is part of our history, and it's basically what happened in Ireland 100 years ago is we had a very weak, poverty-ridden state, economically very weak, not a lot of investment in terms of capitalism for a country of the time. And the parties that came to power had to lean on the Catholic Church for authority and support, and they outsourced the care of and the education and the health service to the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church acted as a repressive force for the general population, which sort of suited, this is in my opinion, the parties of the time. And we're still living with that legacy. Yeah. So the population have changed in their attitudes in so many ways, but the establishment and the political elite hasn't changed at all. And they're never willing to take on the Catholic Church unless they're really forced to. And I think what's happening now 3 years after repeal, there's a whole number of issues that, those of us who want change have to fight on. And I suppose like one of the big issues at the moment is the National Maternity Hospital is actually going to be on Catholic owned land, and will it actually carry out abortions on Catholic land? Most of us think no, it won't, but yet the government is still willing to do a deal with the church on the National Maternity Hospital. So you can just see how the establishment is so behind the general population. So what we can do is we have to raise these issues very strongly. We have to protest, where appropriately, where we can. And we also have to demand that political parties reflect the change that people want. It's just so funny. Even there's a by-election taking place now, and I see Fianna Fáil, which is the party that opposed repeal, is actually trying to pretend that their candidate played a big role in bringing abortion rights into Ireland. So, but while annoying and funny in some ways, it is also a reflection of the fact that they know the type of society they have to reflect, But yes. I think we have to demand full separation of church and state, and that has to become a big political issue. It has to be something that people look, when they vote, but also we have to reignite the movement that brought about the changes that have come about in Ireland, which weren't granted by Parliament. There's a quote from an black anti-slavery activist, Frederick Douglass: "Without struggle, there is no progress." And I think we have to remember that's how people won all of the rights that have been won in terms of the right to vote, or trade unions, or basic civil rights that people have, came about through struggle. Yes. And I think there's so many issues that need addressing. At the moment, it seems quite difficult which do you target, but definitely sex education is one that I would say is important, because another thing that we haven't mentioned in relation to it is that the far right are using sex education as one of their battlegrounds. So they've tried to use this issue in elections. They've been leafleting, they've been, raising it at school gates. And they're trying to kind of bring up this image of children being hypersexualized at a very early age. Mm-hmm. If there's sex education in schools, and they're trying to kind of create fears among parents about, things are going too far. And I've noticed.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, we have the same situation in Poland. The difference is that they are actually in power now, so you can imagine how difficult it is.
I mean, I would have some friends who are Polish and would be aware from activists who live here of the horrendous situation in Poland, and again, largely instigated by the Catholic Church. I mean, in Ireland, we're at a point where the Catholic Church has to stay out of things as much as possible, but they're still retaining control over the health and education system. And in my opinion, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, and to be honest, the Labour Party, because they would have been in arrangements with them. And even, you'd have to say, what is the stance of Sinn Féin? Because up until very recently, and I see they've changed their position recently, they didn't put forward the idea of separating church and state. They were quite slow and behind the movement that's been happening in Ireland on this issue. We saw that with repeal, where they stood even during the referendum.
Why do you think it's slow on their part? Is that because of the history?
Well, I think because Sinn Féin is a nationalist movement, and it's not a left or a socialist movement, and it tends to be left and socialist parties that most champion the separation of church and state and social progress, and that's just the reality of it. There wouldn't be abortion rights in Ireland without socialists who championed it in the Dáil, in the Parliament, and who built active movements on it as well. Sinn Féin played no role. We saw that in the north, where abortion rights weren't taken up by Sinn Féin there either. And also probably because they lean on the Catholic population in the north for their base. So, they're going to be much less likely to come into any conflict with the Catholic hierarchy. Now, I think that'll change somewhat, because obviously Sinn Féin is getting a large youth vote, and if they don't reflect the change, they won't get the youth vote. But I just would say for your listeners that if we had a left government, for example, we'd have much more dramatic and much quicker social change.
You mentioned that Catholic Church is in control of hospitals in Ireland too. I think the matter of Irish schools being in control, having the patronage of Catholic Church is more known, but I don't think especially my Polish listeners know about the control of hospitals. Can you just say a few words about that?
Yeah, well, this is a very important and dangerous control, in my opinion, because how the Catholic Church would have had this control is that we never really had a welfare state or welfare system as would have happened in Britain, after the Second War, when they set up the National Health Service and, a strong social welfare system, because that was demanded by the working class in Britain at that time, after the difficulties and privations of the war. In Ireland, we have a weaker state, like it was a neo-colonial country that, as I said, leaned on the church for authority and support. And the governments of the time, the Catholic Church would have been in private healthcare. That would be a tradition that they would have throughout Europe and, the world. These religious orders that would have done hospital work. So that system was maintained, whereby the Catholic Church set up private hospitals with the money that they had. And then the state basically pays the wages pays the salaries, pays for the buildings of new hospitals and schools, but yet leaves the church in control of them. And in terms of the health service, that has huge repercussions because particularly if you look at maternity hospitals or hospitals that deal with any maternal services or reproduction, it has an impact for women. So you have a situation whereby the Catholic Church would have controlled a lot of the maternity hospitals, and you wouldn't be able to obviously access an abortion or contraception. In the Mater Hospital, which is a major hospital in Dublin, I mean, if you're a woman and you're in there and you're on the pill, for example, and you need to get it prescribed during your hospital stay, certainly up until recently, they wouldn't prescribe it. So even though the law of the land allows these things, the Catholic Church doesn't have to go along with them. And now we have a battle. Well, only half of the maternity hospitals at the moment are providing abortion services fully, even though we changed the law 3 years ago. Only 1 in 10 GPs are providing it. So you have this hangover situation where if you leave, and that's why the sex ed bill is important, that we want to break this ethos and this control. Because if you leave them in control, which the government is trying to pretend, if we bring in a bill, they'll implement it. No, they don't implement the law of the land in their areas of control. So there's a battle opening up right now over, as I mentioned, this National Maternity Hospital, whereby it's in Holles Street, the major one of the major maternity hospitals. And the government 4 years ago was doing this deal with the same religious orders that ran a lot of the Magdalene laundries and, mother and baby homes, who control that St. Vincent's Hospital. And only for it was alerted and publicised by one of the doctors who used to run the hospital, people wouldn't have known about it. And they were basically handing over the National Maternity Hospital to this religious order, doing a deal in order to get land from them to build a new hospital. And that has actually continued to be an area of contention. And now at the moment, it looks like what the Catholic Church have done is they've set up this private group. So it doesn't look like it's been handed to the nuns, but actually this private company will still be run with the ethos of the church. And again, the government is willing to go along with this unless we act and prevent it happening. And I think there's going to be a protest, for example, on that issue in a couple of weeks' time. And I do think what we're seeing is we're going to have all these individual battles going on these issues unless we actually separate church and state and have, radical transformation of society, to be honest. And even if you look at the mother and baby homes issue, that's a big issue at the moment. The religious orders never paid the proper compensation to the victims that was agreed, yes, for all of the previous scandals that emerged. And they've huge land. They have enough land to sort out our housing crisis, for example. And what the religious orders are doing is they're selling off a lot of their land and they're making a huge amount of money out of it. And it tends to be to private companies for luxury housing. So, again, if you had a socialist government, we would take that land and those assets in compensation to make redress to the hundreds and thousands of victims of the abuse of the Catholic Church in this country. And we'd also, provide affordable and social housing on those lands. But anyway, I think that you can see how the control of the church does have huge repercussions. It isn't just in education, it's in health. Yeah. And it's also throughout the charity sector as well, and the disability sector. Because And I'm not saying, by the way, that there aren't good individuals from those religious orders that work in these areas at all, because obviously there are. But the point is that the overall institution of the church is maintaining control, and it isn't willing to allow democracy, really, because we have voted to have these services, and yet they're not being provided. And one of the reasons, the big reasons for the repeal movement was the tragic death of Savita, which yes, I'm sure your listeners will be very aware of.
I spoke of it on the radio, so whoever listened to that, they will know. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There could be more Savitas right now in our hospital system, because even though we voted for a repeal, there's actually, the law can still be criminalising doctors if they breach it. So, you have situations whereby if a woman needed an abortion, a lot of the hospitals aren't actually still providing those services, and doctors still might hesitate in case they fall foul of the law. And if the National Maternity Hospital is kept under the control of this St. Vincent's healthcare company, you could have another Savita, a woman who lands up in a hospital, particularly migrant women, by the way. There's a much higher chance that you won't get the treatment that you need if you're not English speaking, or if you're from a minority. So it is important that the stranglehold of the church is broken in health and education.
Yes, so it all goes down to the separation of church and state. This is just what you just explained, it blew my mind, because although I was aware of the Catholic Church control of the hospitals in some regard, I didn't really put it together in many aspects of the problem when I spoke to Mara Clark on abortion rights. And I was so enthusiastic at the time, thinking that the repeal of the 8 was such a great success, and I was totally oblivious to so many issues that follow. And then I've listened to you and some of the videos that are available online, and I recommend them to everyone. When you spoke on the on, as you say, it's unfinished business, and about the ongoing struggle for the reproductive justice and rights in Ireland, even after 3 years after the repeal of the 8. So although it was a great victory, still, because of the church influence over the hospitals, this seems like it's really heartbreaking, to be honest. I
just want to put it in context. Obviously, the repeal was a huge victory, and it's something that I'm extremely happy about and celebratory of, because the reality is, women and pregnant people can now access abortion in this country, and that is a massive achievement. And the biggest part of the achievement was the fact that you don't have to give any reason up until 12 weeks. Now, I would prefer, obviously, what the Citizens' Assembly put forward, which went much further than that. But unfortunately, we were dealing with politicians who brought in the law. But that is a huge victory. But there are still problems in that many, the provision of it on a regional basis, the provision of it in, like, for example, there's still one county, I think, that there's no GP providing the service. So there are problems and issues, but it is still way, way better than what the situation was before. I mean, somebody can get an abortion free now, whereas we had to travel to another country, for that huge expense and stigma, secrecy and shame. That's gone. But there are still battlegrounds on the legislation itself, in that there are still people with medical conditions having to travel outside the country. And there's going to be a review of the legislation, and we should make sure that we demand the change that's needed. But so I wouldn't lose sight of that huge achievement. But the problem is we have this dichotomy, this contradiction, whereby a movement from below of women, of young people, of LGBT plus people who played a big role in that referendum, who forced that change for over 5 years since the death of Savita. But we need to go further, because we need a repeal style movement again on the issue of separating church and state fully. Because as long as the control is left, we will still have difficult situations. But I wouldn't be disheartened. I would actually take heart from what we achieved on repeal, because we should look at what was achieved there and try and bring it now into play on the other issues.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a very good insight. So it seems to me even more important, the fight for the objective sex education and relationship, because it ties in with the whole issue regarding separation of church and state. Yes, all obviously connected, but it's more connected than I imagined before. Now,
and I mean, unfortunately, in the last general election, people like myself and people on the left struggled to get elected because of you had a swing to Sinn Féin and to the Greens.
Yeah.
And so in constituencies where I am, it meant like socialists got squeezed out in some cases. But we have to have obviously socialists in the Dáil who will bring these issues centre stage, like we did before, because and unfortunately that's not the situation right now. But it is another point that I would say to people, that when you do vote, you should consider those issues.
Of course. You are campaigning for re-election?
Yeah, well, nobody knows when the next election will be, obviously. And obviously with COVID, there probably would have been an election only for COVID. This government sort of cobbled together to deal with that crisis. Mm-hmm. But I will. It's not going to be easy though, because as I said, there is this. People are hungry for an alternative to the two big parties, and possibly looking to Sinn Féin or others. But yeah, I will certainly be fighting in the next election to try to regain a seat for working class people, for women's rights and social progress.
That's great. That's a great news, and we definitely need you. Just to remind those who would like to support you that you rely on donations from people, not from businesses. So that's very important. This support is crucial. For those who might be considering supporting you in the next election when it finally comes, I just want to maybe quickly tell people what you stand for. So you have a fantastic website. Anyway, I would invite everyone to go and look at it. It's called rozumu.ie, and you raise attention to matters such as, for instance, the 14 gender pay gap and unpaid work of women, sexual harassment and sexual violence, the sexual education, of course, as well, housing crisis and the urgent need of change of policy, You also urge for establishing fair rent agency. You believe that the 13 billion of tax that Apple owns could be used towards housing. You also advocate for some radical changes in relation to climate change. You say we need the radical global mass movement and massive investment in renewable energy. You also speak of the minimum wage and that it must be brought up to 15 euros per hour, and that the pension age has to be brought back to 65 again. What else? Obviously, you call for all forms of racism, sexism, transphobia, homophobia to end, and you advocate strongly for the LGBTQ inclusive sex education and rights. Permanent contracts for workers and the repeal of the anti-trade union law, and organize all workers in a union. No to sectarianism and state oppression. Also, you say that we have to abolish all tax exemption of the super rich. So I guess this is it ticks all boxes for me anyway, and I believe for many. So yes, I really encourage everyone to look at your website and listen to you and read all the material that is available online, because you are a great candidate. Yes, I just want to comment on the fact that in Poland, as you know, not long after the war, we had so-called communism, although specialists are saying it wasn't a communism, it was a socialist state. And we obviously fought against it, and we never appreciated the fact that because of that, we had this, we still have those secular schools. And although the curriculum at present is heavily influenced by the people and power, and they are trying to get more influence. This is something that's also kind of ties Ireland and Poland, and the struggle is real, as you say. Do you want to comment on any of the issues I just listed, and what's the most important matter, for instance, you think is for you at the moment? I know they are all very important, but would you like to pay attention to some one?
Yeah,
particular?
like the last year, obviously, I haven't been in the Dáil. I've returned to teaching part-time, and I'm, maintaining political activism the rest of the time. So the kind of big issues have been very COVID dominated, but I've been very supportive of the Debenhams workers who were laid off by the multinational and who fought for their jobs and their redundancy, and they were mainly women workers as well, by the way. And women are much more likely to lose out during COVID. They're 3 times more likely to lose their jobs. And women are fighting the pandemic on the front lines. But also there's been a massive surge in gender violence during the lockdowns worldwide. So that's another issue I've been very active in raising. And just to mention, actually, to your listeners, this is something that's just come up, that Rosa is being prosecuted for organising a socially distant standout of 10 people on the issue of gender violence in Limerick. And it seems to be, according to the Irish Council for Civil Liberties anyway, the first organisation that they know of being prosecuted in this way under, these pandemic public health laws, which obviously we support public health, but an outdoor protest that was socially distant, people were wearing facial coverings and highlighting what is a public health issue, which is the rocketing in gender violence and intimate partner violence in particular. So they've been some issues, and I'm also very involved right now in assisting the family of George and Kencho, the young man that was shot dead by Gardaí here in my area in December, which I think is a very frightening development, whereby somebody can be shot dead on their doorstep at least 5 times by Gardaí. And I think it's something that the entire community should be concerned about, not just people of colour or minorities, but all of us.
Yeah.
And, you know, there's a protest organised around that shortly, so that's something that I'm working on. I'll continue to be fighting on all those issues in or out of Parliament, and, you know, actually out of Parliament is where I've spent most of my time since I got involved politically since I was 17. So I really would appeal to people we have to be active politically, you know, and when I say politically, I don't mean the Parliament or the Dáil, I mean on these important issues. And we have to learn the lessons from repeal, that when we do organise together, huge change can be achieved. And I'd appeal to anyone who is listening, be it in Poland, Ireland or elsewhere, to become politically engaged and become politically active, because I think that's really going to be necessary, because COVID is already is triggering and will trigger a crisis in the economy, because who's going to pay for COVID? Who's going to pay for the PUP payment or for whatever supports governments were forced to introduce? It'll be the working class that they come to make pay. And I think people have to get together and, you know, get organised so that we aren't made to pay in the way we were 10 years ago when the financial system collapsed.
Of course. Before we wrap up, I would like also ask you to comment on the housing crisis, because this is something that's recently a very hot topic in the Dáil. And my colleagues befriended a musical band called Tour from Gweedore, from Donegal. They just released their song, which is a fantastic tune, but also is very politically charged, and I recommend to listen to it. It's called, it looks like a good spot for some luxury apartments. It's a long title, but you get this irony. And it's, so this is something that's probably I would like to hear from you on.
Yeah, the housing crisis is something that over the years I've taken up hugely, because I think I'm probably living in the homeless centre of Ireland, because Dublin West has tended to be the area where there was a massive population growth in the last 20 years, and there was a lot of private rented accommodation and also a lot of young families. So we started seeing people being made homeless back in 2014, like 7 years ago, that this really 7 or 8 years ago that this really started to hit. And it's also the constituency of the Taoiseach and 2 other ministers, by the way. But there's a huge housing crisis here and a homeless crisis, and yet we have land sitting a couple of 100 yards away from me here that's owned by the council and could be developed to build, you know, over 1,000 housing units, you know. That would make a huge dent into the local housing crisis, and it just isn't happening. And it's because there's been this neoliberal trend in capitalism in the last number of years, whereby the state role is minimised down to the lowest possible, and public housing, which would have been a very common thing when I was growing up. I was brought up in a council house. There was hundreds of houses getting built around me. And despite what some of the parties...
Hello?
Some of the parties now would like to demonise, which they call it social housing now. Again, that's a new term, because that was not a term that was ever used when I was growing up. Because actually even that makes it sound like people are in need of social help if they live in a council house. And like in the 70s and 80s, you would have had 8,000-9,000 council houses built a year, whereas in the last few years you would have had, a couple of hundred. And this is the root of the crisis. Like, it's not complicated at all. If the state doesn't get involved in housing, the market determines, and we all know what that means. It means that if you've loads of money, you can buy a house or rent a house, and if you don't, you can't. And I mean, the rent around, I don't need to probably spend time telling your listeners, but they're absolutely shocking. So I would regularly have had, when I was a TD and a counsellor in this area before that, having to deal with families. We would have had big meetings here in Blanchardstown on homelessness and housing, where we had people attending, people crying at the meetings. It was actually very upsetting. It was very, very difficult issue, even for myself, and people working in my office needed counselling nearly after dealing with people, because, what can you do? You're so powerless in the whole situation. And it is a criminal thing that's being done, because the mental health, the physical health damage that's being done to kids, that's being done to, it tends to be mainly, but not exclusively obviously, but very much single women who are lone parents, who are at the hard end of this because they're on their own and they don't have the money, and they've been left responsible for their children. So very upsetting situations, and there's nothing complicated about this. Unless councils and the state build houses at a huge rate, we're going to be staying in this crisis for another 10 years. It's nearly 10 years already now that they've allowed this to happen. And again, I would urge people, we need political change. Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, and again Labour somewhat as well, don't stand for public housing. And unless we use the land that's available to build that type of housing, we're going to continue on in this desperate situation.
Yes, I can tell you what's happening in my area just now, and this is partly to do with the COVID situation as well. I haven't heard anyone speaking about it yet publicly, but this is only a small part of the problem. But what I've noticed here, now obviously the COVID pandemic made some people from big cities to start working from home, and they have a problem with accommodation in big cities, which, as you said, is extremely expensive if you are renting, for instance. Since they started working from home, it doesn't matter where they really reside. So this is like a domino effect. So what happens, obviously, is they're right. They move back to their, for instance, small hometowns or villages, like they come to Donegal or to Gweedore specifically. And because the rent for them here is probably half the rent and where they live, and that's fantastic. And obviously they do that to survive as well. Or they buy houses here, and the housing market here is basically exploding at the minute. All those people who got the opportunity to work from home, they are moving to this to live the nice life in the countryside, and obviously we should be happy for them, but that causes a problem for the local people who are renting, because now what I've heard while looking for accommodation, the rent went up by a few hundreds of euros recently, and if you ask a landlord to lower the rent because it's already more than about 200 or 300 more than you pay currently, they would answer, and I actually personally heard that answer from a landlord, that there are people coming from bigger city who can afford this rent no problem. So now they are coming with bigger wages, and this is the right. And but people in the countryside, they are still with their countryside wages, and there's no way for us to compete on the rental market, never mind on on the housing market in general. We are basically like, houses here are relatively cheap in comparison to other places. So if someone gets the opportunity to work from home, will move here very willingly because it's beautiful here and it's cheap. And but then, the problem is a domino effect. So it's obviously we would do the same if we were in those big cities. The thing is, we are here and we have to deal with that, and it's becoming a serious issue. I don't know if someone brought that to your attention yet.
No, I can see exactly what you're saying now, because people will, if they're allowed to work from home, now choose to migrate, and
that's built also. Sorry, that's built on unnecessary social tension. Because I already heard people commenting on that in a very unpleasant manner, because yes, people are struggling, are afraid of their livelihood, they're afraid of becoming homeless. Sorry. If you like to comment on that.
Exactly. Look, this is why we need the state to be the key provider of housing, all around where it's needed. That's the only way that this can be stopped, because if you leave private landlords, vulture funds, etc., in control, they will eke out the highest rent that's possible. And I have a situation here where a family, they've gone past their eviction date in a place that they've been living for about 10, 11 years. And, landlords are seeing the possibility to get rid of tenants.
Yes.
And pretend that they're selling. That's the usual reason that you give. It's very easy to do, and you're legally allowed to do it, which is another bill, by the way, that I had in the Parliament, that you would get rid of these legal ways of evicting people. And so they're allowing the private market to dictate, and we only have to look. A government that allows, venture capitalist companies to come and buy whole housing estates, up the road from me here, and I'm sure in Donegal, etc. They bought up a whole housing estate in Hollystown in Dublin 15 here. And then you've got young people who are trying to buy something and having a hope. So look, we have to demand public homes are built on public land, and has to be the root of this problem, because if the private market is left in control, there's no hope. It'll always be the law of the jungle.
Yeah. Now, I have to say big thank you for this extremely insightful talk. I really appreciate your time and also everything you do. Now, I would like to encourage everyone to support you and donate. And I believe that, and I hope and believe that your party and yourself will be re-elected. And I wish for Ireland to have such a Taoiseach as yourself.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the interview.
Thank you very much, and have a good day, and keep up the good work. Thank you, Ruth.
Thanks, Megan. Bye.
Been a pleasure. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.